Mia tightened the strings of her apron, staring at the dimly lit employee entrance of Clarkson's supermarket. The air outside was thick and damp, carrying the faint scent of rain-soaked pavement. She hated the overnight shift. The emptiness of the store after hours turned an ordinary job into something eerie. The hum of fluorescent lights and the soft whir of refrigeration units felt oppressive rather than comforting. Another night, another dollar, she muttered under her breath, pushing the heavy door open. Inside, the store was unnervingly quiet. During the day, Clarkson's was a bustling hub, with customers swarming every aisle, carts clattering, and cash registers beeping in unison. But at night, the store took on an entirely different personality. The aisles seemed longer, the shelves taller, and every creak or rustle echoed like a shout. Mia clocked in, her footsteps loud in the deserted break room. She glanced at the schedule pinned to the bulletin board. It confirmed what she already knew: she was alone tonight. That was the worst part. Normally, there were 2 or 3 people on the overnight shift, enough to make the empty store feel less like a tomb. But her co-worker called in sick, and the manager had decided not to bring in a replacement. She walked out onto the sales floor, the automatic doors at the front of the store sliding open and closed despite the lack of customers. The store's open 24/7 policy meant that anyone could wander in at any time, but few ever did during the graveyard hours. Mia started her tasks for the night, restocking shelves in aisle 4. She tried to focus, letting the mundane rhythm of unpacking boxes and arranging cans lull her into a sense of normalcy. The canned goods clinked softly as she placed them in neat rows. It wasn't long before she became aware of the silence pressing down around her. The usual white noise of the store seemed distant, as if it was being muffled by something unseen. "Just the quiet playing tricks on you," she whispered to herself, but her voice did little to fill the void. The minutes dragged on. She finished restocking the aisle and moved to the dairy section. The chill from the refrigerated cases prickled her skin as she knelt to organize cartons of milk. As she worked, a faint sound reached her ears, a soft shuffling, like someone dragging their feet across the floor. She froze, her hand hovering over a carton. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. No answer. The sound stopped. Mia stood slowly, peering down the aisle. Her eyes scanned the space, searching for movement, but there was nothing, just rows of neatly stocked dairy products and the faint reflection of the fluorescent lights on the polished floor. She shook her head, muttering, "Get a grip, Mia. It's just your imagination." She returned to her task, but the unease lingered. The store felt different. It was as if the shadows in the corners had grown thicker, darker. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, a common occurrence that suddenly felt far more sinister. As she finished with the dairy section, a loud clatter came from somewhere in the store. The sound of cans or jars hitting the floor reverberated through the aisles. Mia jumped, clutching the edge of the cooler for support. "Seriously?" she muttered, her voice tight. "Probably just something I didn't stack right." She walked toward the noise, her sneakers squeaking on the tiles. The sound had come from aisle 7, where the pasta sauces and condiments were stocked. As she turned the corner, her breath hitched. A jar of marinara sauce lay shattered on the floor, its contents smeared in a crimson streak across the tiles. But what made her stomach twist wasn't the mess. It was the fact that the jar had fallen from the top shelf, far out of reach unless someone had knocked it over. Mia scanned the aisle, her eyes darting to every corner, but she was alone. She crouched to clean up the mess, her hands trembling as she picked up the larger shards of glass. "I'm not alone here," she whispered. The thought crept in unbidden, sending a shiver down her spine. But she pushed it aside. There had to be an explanation. A breeze from the air conditioning? A vibration from the coolers? She couldn't let herself spiral. After cleaning the spill, Mia decided to take a break. She returned to the break room, the fluorescent light flickering ominously as she entered. She poured herself a cup of stale coffee from the pot and sat at the small table in the corner, her back to the room's only window. The break room's clock ticked loudly, each second stretching longer than the last. Mia's eyes were heavy, her body worn from hours of work and mounting anxiety. She was almost dozing off when a faint sound pulled her back to reality, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the window behind her. Mia froze, her hands gripping the table. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, as if someone, or something, was trying to get her attention. Summoning every ounce of courage, she turned her head slowly. There was nothing there. Her heart was pounding as she stood and approached the window. The parking lot beyond was empty, bathed in the orange glow of a single flickering street lamp. But as she leaned closer to the glass, a faint outline began to take shape. A handprint, smeared and ghostly, appeared on the outside of the window. Mia stumbled back, her chair toppling over. The handprint was too high to belong to any person. It was too long, too narrow, distorted in a way that sent ice through her veins. And then, the lights in the break room went out. Mia stood frozen in the pitch-black break room, the darkness swallowing her whole. Her breathing grew shallow, each inhale sharp and panicked. The faint hum of the refrigeration units in the store was now muffled, as if the building itself held its breath. She fumbled for her phone, her trembling fingers struggling to unlock it. The screen's faint glow illuminated her face, casting eerie shadows across the room. With a swipe, she activated the flashlight, the beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. Her heart hammered as she scanned the room. The overturned chair lay where she had left it, but nothing else seemed disturbed. Yet the feeling of being watched was so strong. It was as though unseen eyes bore into her from every direction. Mia edged toward the door, her flashlight casting long, jittery shadows across the walls. As she reached for the handle, a noise stopped her dead in her tracks, a low, guttural groan, like the sound of air being forced through rusted pipes. But it didn't come from the plumbing. It came from somewhere in the store. Her mind raced. Maybe someone else was here after all. But if they were, why hadn't they answered when she called earlier? And what kind of person made a sound like that? Mia swung the door open, stepping cautiously into the now darkened store. The flashlight's beam wavered as her hands trembled. The once familiar aisles now seemed labyrinthine, their ends disappearing into the shadows. The emergency lights, usually a faint comfort during power outages, failed to activate, leaving the store completely shrouded in darkness. "Hello?" Mia's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Is someone there?" No answer, just the faint rustle of what might have been the air conditioning, except the air felt unnaturally still. She made her way toward the customer service desk, where the store's landline was located. If she could call her manager or even the police, maybe she'd feel less like prey in a predator's territory. As she turned the corner into aisle 3, she froze. The shelves on either side of her bore neat rows of canned goods, but the middle of the aisle was a disaster. Boxes and cans were scattered everywhere, as though someone or something had rampaged through. Her flashlight beam caught a faint smear of something dark trailing along the floor, leading toward the back of the store. Mia's instincts screamed at her to turn around and leave, to abandon the store and never come back. But some part of her, the part conditioned by years of being told to finish her shift no matter what, forced her feet to move forward. She followed the smear cautiously, her flashlight trembling as she aimed it down the aisle. The trail led to the door marked "Employees Only." The storeroom. She stared at it, her pulse pounding in her ears. Suddenly, the door creaked open a few inches, the sound slicing through the oppressive silence. Mia stopped breathing. Her flashlight beam focused on the crack in the door, but the darkness beyond it was impenetrable. For a moment, nothing moved, and then the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Mia staggered backward, a scream caught in her throat. Her flashlight flickered, threatening to leave her in total darkness. She turned and sprinted toward the customer service desk, her sneakers squeaking loudly on the tile floor. Reaching the desk, she fumbled for the phone, yanking it off the receiver. Dead silence. "No, no, no, no," she whispered, jabbing at the buttons. There was no dial tone, no static, nothing. The line was completely dead. Her flashlight flickered again, and she slapped it desperately. It steadied, but the beam felt weaker, its reach shorter. She took a deep breath, trying to steel herself. If the phone was out, she needed her cell. She had left it in the break room. She turned, ready to make a dash for the back of the store, when the sound of faint footsteps stopped her in her tracks. They were slow, deliberate, and growing louder. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end as she realized the sound wasn't coming from behind her. It was coming from above. Her eyes darted upward. The ceiling panels, normally dull and gray, seemed to shift and tremble. Then she saw it, a shadow moving swiftly across the panels, following her every step. She stifled a scream, clamping a hand over her mouth as her flashlight beam danced erratically across the floor and walls. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, with a deafening crash, one of the ceiling panels fell, shattering on the floor just feet away from her. She screamed, stumbling backward as a figure dropped through the opening. But it wasn't human. The thing crouched on the floor, its limbs too long, its body hunched and twisted. The pale, waxy skin stretched taut over its angular frame, and its eyes, dark, hollow pits, seemed to drink in the faint light. It tilted its head toward her, an unnatural motion that sent chills down her spine. Mia didn't wait to see what it would do. She turned and ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she darted through the aisles. The thing let out a screech, a sound so sharp and primal it made her ears ring. She could hear it scrambling after her, its claws clicking on the tile floor. She reached the break room door and slammed it shut behind her, twisting the lock with trembling hands. She grabbed her phone from the table, the screen lighting up with a comforting glow. But as she tried to call 911, the screen froze, the numbers smearing into unreadable shapes. The phone grew hot in her hand, and she dropped it with a yelp. The screeching stopped. For a moment, the only sound was her own labored breathing. She pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear any sign of movement. Nothing. And then, from the far corner of the break room, came a slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap. The tapping grew louder, closer. Mia's heart hammered in her chest as she backed away from the door. Her breathing was shallow, each inhale sharp and uneven. The faint tapping had a rhythm to it now, like someone, or something, deliberately testing the walls, searching for her. The darkness in the break room seemed to stretch farther, suffocating her in a way she hadn't felt before. Her thoughts raced, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The lights, the strange sound in the back room, the figure in the ceiling. None of it made sense. The rational part of her mind screamed that she was just imagining things, that there was an explanation, but the terror gnawing at her gut told her otherwise. The tapping stopped. Mia held her breath, her eyes locked on the door, listening for the slightest sound. The store was eerily silent now, not even the hum of the refrigeration units to break the tension. Just the deafening stillness. Then, suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the front of the store, like something heavy had been thrown to the floor. Mia flinched, her pulse spiking. She wanted to run, but her legs felt like lead, frozen in place by the fear that had taken root deep in her chest. She had to get out. The back exit. She could make it to the alleyway and out of the building. If she could just get to the door. Her eyes flicked to the clock on the wall. It was almost 4 a.m. The store had been closed for hours. How long had she been trapped here? Time seemed to lose all meaning in this suffocating darkness. And then she heard it. A low, wet breathing sound coming from the other side of the door. It was slow, deliberate, like it was waiting for her to make a move. Mia's skin prickled, and her heart seemed to stop. She backed away, her mind racing. What was that thing? What did it want from her? The breathing continued, each inhale and exhale slower than the last, like it was savoring the sound of her fear. Mia's breath hitched. She needed to think, needed to find a way out. But her options were limited. She could either face whatever was waiting for her on the other side of the door, or find another way out, if there was one. Her eyes flicked to the window above the sink. It was small, maybe just big enough for her to crawl through if she could get it open. But she'd have to move fast, and the sound of whatever was out there was growing louder. The door creaked. Mia's heart skipped a beat. She spun around, eyes wide in panic, but it wasn't the door she feared. The tap-tap-tapping had started again, this time coming from inside the break room. Her eyes darted to the corner where the noise seemed to originate. The shadows there seemed to twitch and shift, as though something was trying to move within them, hidden just beyond the light. Without thinking, Mia bolted toward the window. She could hear the breathing now, almost directly behind her, and she had no idea what would happen if she turned around to face it. The glass of the window was cold to the touch as she yanked on it, but it wouldn't budge. Panic rose in her throat. She pounded on the frame, desperate, her breath fogging the glass. A muffled screech pierced the air, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Too heavy, too fast. Mia didn't dare look behind her. She kept tugging on the window with all her strength, her body shaking, her nails scraping the cold metal. And then finally, with a sharp snap, the window opened. Mia didn't hesitate. She squeezed her body through the narrow space, barely managing to avoid getting caught on the frame. Her knees scraped against the side of the building as she dropped down into the alley, the cold night air hitting her like a slap to the face. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she scrambled to her feet, the darkness of the alley stretching around her like a vast, empty void. She was free, for now, but as she ran, her mind replayed the last few moments in the break room. The tapping, the breathing, the heavy footsteps. She didn't know what it was that had been hunting her, but she knew one thing: it wasn't over. It was still out there, and if it could find her once, it could find her again. Mia's pulse still raced as she sprinted down the alleyway, her shoes slapping against the wet pavement. The night air was cold, biting, and her breath came in sharp gasps. The sound of her footsteps echoed around her, but there was something else, something just beyond her hearing. A subtle shift in the air, a whispering sound that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She didn't dare look back. The street lights ahead seemed so far away, like distant beacons guiding her towards safety. Every step felt like it took an eternity, and the deeper she ran into the night, the more she felt as if something was closing in. The fear in her chest was growing, no longer a mere flutter, but a suffocating weight pressing against her ribs, making it harder to breathe. She rounded a corner, her eyes scanning the dark street. It was eerily quiet, too quiet. No cars, no people, nothing but the whisper of the wind rustling the leaves in the trees above her. Mia's mind screamed at her to keep moving, to get to the nearest intersection, to call for help. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Something had followed her. The sensation was subtle at first, a flicker in her peripheral vision, a shadow darting just outside the reach of the streetlights. But the more she tried to ignore it, the more intense it became. Her heart began to race again, her stomach twisting into knots. She didn't want to turn around. She couldn't. She couldn't risk it. And then she heard it. Soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. The faintest sound of footsteps echoing behind her, matching her own. She froze in place, the blood draining from her face as the realization hit her. She wasn't alone. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Mia's breath caught in her throat, her legs trembling beneath her. She wanted to scream, to shout for help, but her voice was trapped somewhere deep inside, suffocated by fear. A low growl, almost like a hiss, filled the air behind her. Mia's body went rigid with terror. She could feel it now, the presence closing in on her. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get away, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. It was as if the darkness itself had become an insurmountable barrier, holding her in place, waiting for the right moment to strike. She had to move. She had to do something. With every ounce of willpower she had left, Mia forced herself to turn. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw it. A figure stood just at the edge of the streetlight's reach, barely visible in the darkness. It was tall, too tall, unnaturally so, and it seemed to sway slightly, as though it was not quite solid. The figure was cloaked in shadows, its features distorted, as though it wasn't entirely part of the world around it. And then its eyes, a pair of glowing orbs, locked onto hers. Mia's breath caught in her throat as her legs finally obeyed, propelling her forward, faster than she ever thought possible. The figure's eyes followed her, unblinking, unmoving. And the footsteps behind her, those heavy, predatory steps, grew louder. She turned another corner, her lungs burning, her legs aching from the strain. She couldn't hear the footsteps anymore, but the sense of being followed never stopped. The darkness pressed in on her, suffocating her, as if the night itself was alive, closing in from all sides. Her mind raced. She had to get to the station. She had to get help. The flashing lights of a police car appeared ahead, and Mia's heart leapt in her chest. She ran toward it, her hands outstretched, hoping, praying, that someone would be there to help her. The closer she got, the more she could see the outline of the patrol car, its lights flashing in the darkness, cutting through the night like a beacon of hope. But as she reached the car, her heart sank. There was no officer in the vehicle. Mia slammed her fists against the car's window in frustration. The silence of the street felt suffocating, the emptiness so overwhelming that it threatened to swallow her whole. The figure from before, the one with the glowing eyes, it was gone. But she could still feel its presence. It was out there, waiting, just beyond the edge of her sight. She collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath, her hands trembling. Her mind was a whirlwind of panic and dread, and in that moment, she realized something horrifying. The thing she had seen, the creature following her, was not just a figment of her imagination. It was real, and it was relentless. Mia sat there, gasping for air, her hands trembling as she fought to regain some semblance of control. The emptiness around her pressed in like a suffocating force. The cold pavement beneath her felt like an anchor, a brief respite from the terror that continued to close in on her. She tried to force herself to think, to focus, but all that echoed in her mind were the hollow footsteps, the growl that lingered in her ears, and the haunting glow of the creature's eyes. She had to do something. The idea of staying here, in this forsaken part of the city, was too much. But where could she go? No one would help. The police car, though it had looked like a sign of safety, was now just another empty reminder that she was utterly alone. Her mind wandered back to the store, the dark, oppressive store where she had been trapped. The events, the terror, had felt so real then, but now they seemed like something distant. A nightmare she couldn't escape. Mia rubbed her forehead, trying to clear the fog of fear, but the feeling was inescapable. The shadow had followed her here, to this street, to this very moment. She rose shakily to her feet, eyes scanning the darkness. The street lights were dim now, their glow barely cutting through the thick, heavy air. The shadows seemed to twist in unnatural ways, creeping like tendrils along the walls of the nearby buildings. The quiet that had once felt eerie now felt suffocating, pressing in from all sides. She could feel it. The presence was still there, lurking, watching, waiting. She needed to get away. But where could she go? The alleyways were deserted, empty and cold. There was no one else. The city that had once felt so familiar was now an unfamiliar maze, and she was the prey. The distant sound of footsteps echoed in the quiet, and Mia froze. They were too loud now, too close. She could feel her heart racing again, the sound of it thudding in her ears. She could hear her breath coming in shallow gasps as she turned, ready to run, but then, nothing. No figure, no presence, just the quiet, the flicker of streetlights in the distance. But something was wrong. Mia's skin crawled. There was movement, a blur in the shadows. She saw it then, not with her eyes, but with some deeper instinct that screamed at her to move, to get out, to run. She didn't question it. Without thinking, she turned and sprinted down the street, not knowing where she was going, only knowing she had to get away. Her legs burned, and her lungs ached with every breath, but she couldn't stop. The footsteps were there again, pacing her, matching her speed, relentless and unyielding. Her mind screamed for escape, for help, anything to make the sensation stop. But the street was empty. The shadows were closing in, and whatever it was following her was growing bolder. Mia didn't know how much time had passed, but her feet were starting to feel like lead. Her breath was ragged, her body fatigued from running aimlessly through the night. She couldn't keep this up for much longer. She needed to hide. She needed safety. Ahead, she saw a small convenience store, its sign flickering weakly in the distance. It was open, at least. It had to be, right? She could make it there. She could get inside, lock the door, and breathe for a moment. The door to safety, to some semblance of control, was so close. But as she approached, her stomach twisted in terror. The door was open. It swayed gently in the breeze, as if inviting her in. But the store was dark, completely dark. No lights, no signs of life inside. Just the silence, broken only by the soft creak of the door as it moved. Mia stopped a few feet away, staring at the doorway. Her instincts screamed at her to turn and leave, to keep running, to not stop, to not go inside. But her body was telling her something else. She had no choice. She couldn't keep running forever. The presence, whatever it was, had to be close. She stepped forward, the sound of her feet crunching on the gravel and asphalt seeming to echo in the still night. The door creaked louder as she pushed it open, the darkness beyond swallowing her whole. Inside, the store was as silent as the night itself. Mia hesitated in the threshold, her eyes adjusting to the gloom, but she saw nothing. The aisles were barren, the shelves empty, the air heavy with the scent of stale dust. There was no movement, no sign of life, and yet she knew she wasn't alone. A soft click echoed in the darkness, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. Mia's heart skipped a beat. She turned toward the sound, her eyes searching frantically for the source, but she saw nothing. The footsteps grew louder, closer, each one deliberate and slow, the air growing colder with each step. Mia's blood ran cold. The footsteps stopped, and then, in the stillness, she heard it. A voice. Faint, like a whisper on the edge of her consciousness, but clear enough to send a shiver through her spine. "You can't hide forever, Mia." She froze. Her name. It knew her name. And then the lights flickered on. The sudden flicker of lights made Mia's heart leap into her throat, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The dim, sickly glow illuminated the aisles, casting long, warped shadows on the walls. For a moment, Mia thought she might have imagined the voice, but the icy chill that crept over her skin, the heavy weight in the air, told her otherwise. She turned slowly, her pulse hammering in her ears, her mind screaming at her to run, to escape. But her legs felt like lead, her body frozen in place, unable to obey. The store seemed to close in on her, the walls growing tighter, the shadows pressing from every angle, as if the very space around her was alive. And then she saw it, the figure. It stood at the far end of the store, bathed in the dim light, its features indistinct and blurry, like an unfinished painting. It was tall, too tall, and unnaturally thin, its limbs elongated in a way that defied human anatomy. Its face was obscured in shadow, but Mia could feel its gaze, its eyes locking onto hers, unseen but present. It was like the air itself shifted, coiling around her, pulling her closer to it. Her mouth went dry, and she tried to speak, to shout, to run, but no words came out. Her throat was constricted, and every instinct screamed at her to turn around and flee. But she was rooted to the spot, unable to move. The figure stepped forward, its feet making no sound on the floor. It was gliding toward her, its presence like a cold wind that froze the very air around her. As it moved, the shadows around it seemed to distort, stretching unnaturally, as though the figure was pulling the darkness itself toward her. Mia's breath hitched. She could feel it now. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. It was something far worse, something beyond comprehension. The coldness, the emptiness it radiated. It was like a void, a black hole of terror that threatened to consume her. The thing stopped a few feet away from her, and the whisper came again, louder this time. It wasn't just a whisper. It was inside her mind, clawing at her thoughts, filling her head with a voice she couldn't escape. "You're not alone, Mia. You never were." The voice wasn't one, but many. A chorus of deep, guttural tones layered together, making her head spin with the overwhelming noise. It was as if the store itself had become alive, the walls speaking to her, the shelves whispering in unison. Mia's vision blurred, her head spinning as the voice twisted inside her skull. She felt her knees weaken, her body threatening to collapse under the weight of the oppressive air. "Please," she whispered, barely able to form the word. Her voice felt foreign, as if she was no longer in control of her own body. "Please leave me alone." The figure's head tilted slightly, as if considering her words. It wasn't quite a nod, but it was close. A strange, unsettling movement that seemed to mock her plea. It reached out, its long, spindly fingers extending toward her, impossibly long, each joint bending at odd angles. Mia staggered backward, her hands pressing against the shelves as if they might offer some kind of escape, some protection from the monstrosity before her. But there was nowhere to go, no way out. The door she had entered through seemed impossibly far now, like a memory from another lifetime. She was trapped. "Help!" she gasped, the word finally breaking free from her paralyzed lips. "Please, someone help me." The figure didn't respond. It didn't need to. It simply continued to move toward her, its body slipping through the shadows like liquid darkness. The space around Mia seemed to close in even further, the walls shifting, pulsating, as though the entire store was alive, drawing her deeper into its grasp. "Help!" she cried again, her voice breaking as terror seized her throat. But the creature stopped, just inches from her now, and for a brief, agonizing moment there was silence. The air around her grew heavier, thicker, and the temperature seemed to plummet. "There's no escape," the voice inside her mind said, so clearly now that she could hear it reverberating in her bones. "You're already part of it." Mia felt a wave of cold wash over her, like ice running through her veins. The words made her heart race, and she realized with sudden clarity that the store wasn't just a place. It was a trap, a prison, and she had been drawn into it. She was part of it now, just like all the others. The creature raised one hand, and Mia could feel the weight of its gaze on her, even though she couldn't see its eyes. The air around her seemed to crackle with energy, like static before a storm. She reached for the door, her hand trembling, but it was already too late. With a soft, unsettling noise, the lights flickered again, then went out. The darkness that followed was complete. Total. The kind of darkness that swallowed all sense of time and space. And for the first time, Mia understood what it meant to truly be alone. Her body tensed, and her breath came in frantic, shallow gasps. She was still standing, she realized, but she couldn't see her own hands in front of her face. The world around her had dissolved into a sea of black. There were no sounds, no movement, just an overwhelming, oppressive stillness. And then the whispers returned. "Welcome home, Mia." This time, there was no mistaking it. The voice came from all around her, echoing in her mind, seeping into her thoughts. The store had become more than just a place. It had become a prison, a living thing that had consumed everything inside. And Mia was no longer alone. Mia's heart pounded in her chest, the sound deafening in the suffocating silence of the store. She couldn't tell if her mind was playing tricks on her, or if the darkness had somehow turned the store into something alive, something that had its own will. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her, each one more insistent than the last. "You're here with us now," the voices whispered, one after another, as though 100 unseen mouths were speaking in unison. "You'll never leave." Her breath hitched as she took a step backward, feeling around in the darkness for the familiar shelves, for anything to ground her. But her fingers met only air. There was no structure, no sense of space. The store had vanished. It was as if it had all collapsed into an endless void. A strange sensation began to creep along her spine, a crawling feeling, like something unseen was just behind her, waiting, watching. Mia whipped around, her heart in her throat, but saw nothing. Only darkness. Empty, consuming darkness. But she felt it. The presence. It was closing in. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice shaky, barely audible. The question felt foolish, as if she already knew the answer. No one would answer. The voices had already made it clear. She was trapped, bound to whatever malevolent force lurked in the dark corners of the store. The temperature plummeted, the cold seeping into her skin, chilling her to the bone. She could feel the air thickening around her, pressing in from all sides. The whispers came again, but now they weren't just words. They were images, thoughts, memories. The first memory that surfaced in her mind was of a past employee, a young woman, her name forgotten, but her face still fresh. Mia hadn't known her. She had been long gone before Mia had started working there. The image of her stood, frozen, in front of the registers, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth open as if she were trying to scream but couldn't. The vision flashed, fading before Mia could truly grasp it. Then another one replaced it. A man, his name unfamiliar, holding a box cutter. His hands shook as he cut through the air, his face twisted in anguish. His actions were erratic, desperate, like he was trying to free himself from something unseen, something that had its claws in him. The images grew more disturbing. They weren't just memories of the people who had worked there, but something far darker. They were fragments of lives that had been twisted by the store's unnatural force. People who had entered and never left. Or worse, people who had been consumed by the very walls around her. Mia staggered backward, her mind racing. She couldn't breathe. It was as if the air itself had become thick with despair, each breath feeling like an effort to inhale the weight of the darkness. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please let me go. I just want to leave." But the voices didn't stop. They grew louder, louder until it felt as if her own thoughts were drowning in them. "You can't leave," the voice from earlier said, cold and final. "Not anymore." Mia could feel the temperature continue to drop, her teeth chattering now as she struggled to keep her composure. There had to be a way out. She had to find a way to escape. And then, just as quickly as the cold had descended, the lights flickered back on. The sudden brightness was jarring, blinding. For a moment, Mia could only blink, disoriented by the abrupt shift. The store around her seemed the same, unchanged, but the oppressive feeling, the sense of being trapped, remained. The shelves were just as they had been before, the aisles stretching endlessly in front of her, but now they felt wrong. It was as though the store had taken on a new layer of reality, a twisted reflection of itself. The air felt charged, buzzing with unseen energy. The whispers still lingered in the back of her mind, but now they were distant, muffled, like the echoes of something long past. She stumbled forward, her legs unsteady, and found herself heading toward the exit. Every step felt heavy, like she was wading through something thick and suffocating. She reached the door, her hand trembling as she tried to turn the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. Mia's breath caught in her throat. Panic surged through her chest, her heart racing in fear. She couldn't leave. Not like this. The whispers started again, louder now, swirling in her ears. Leaving is impossible. The words didn't make sense. She had to leave. She had to get out. She couldn't stay here, not with whatever haunted this place, not with the twisted memories of those who had worked here before her. She gripped the handle harder, pulling with all her strength, but the door wouldn't open. It was as though it had been sealed from the other side, a barrier that refused to break. Mia turned away from the door, her eyes darting across the store. The shelves seemed to lean in toward her, the aisles narrowing like they were trying to close her in. The air was thick, oppressive, and every corner of the store seemed to hide something, something that had been waiting. She turned back to the aisle where she had seen the strange figure earlier, but there was nothing there now. Only the empty shelves, the faint hum of the lights overhead. It should have been comforting, but it wasn't. The emptiness felt hungry. It was then that Mia realized the truth. The store wasn't just haunted, it was alive, feeding off her fear, her anxiety. It had always been like this, twisting reality, drawing in anyone who walked through its doors. She wasn't the first to be trapped, and she wouldn't be the last. Mia's pulse hammered in her ears, her breath shallow as she backed away from the door. There was no escape, not from the store, and certainly not from whatever was hunting her within its walls. Her thoughts raced, trying to find some kind of logic, something to cling to, but it was impossible. The store had become its own entity, a dark, malevolent force, feeding on her fear, toying with her. Her gaze darted around the room, landing on the security monitors beside the registers. The screens flickered slightly, as though disturbed by an unseen force, but they showed the entire store, the aisles, the shelves, the cluttered corners. At first, she thought it was a glitch, just a technical issue, but as she looked closer, something caught her eye. A figure, standing still in one of the aisles. Its shape was vague, distorted by the poor quality of the security footage, but it was unmistakable. It was tall, too tall, with an elongated form that seemed to stretch unnaturally as it twisted in the shadows. The hairs on the back of Mia's neck stood on end. She took a step closer to the monitors, her breath catching in her throat as the figure moved, slowly, deliberately, like it was searching for something. Or someone. For her. She could feel it, deep in her gut, a primal instinct telling her that the figure on the screen wasn't human, that it wasn't something she could reason with. It was a creature of the darkness, a manifestation of the store's malevolence. It didn't belong here, not in the world she knew, and yet, somehow, it had become part of the store's twisted existence. Mia backed away from the monitors, her thoughts scrambled. She had to think. She had to get out of here. But then the lights flickered again, the hum of the fluorescent bulbs growing louder, sharper. Her stomach dropped. It was happening again. The power was going out. And with it, everything she thought she knew about the store, about reality itself, seemed to shift. The store became darker. The walls seemed to close in, the aisles narrowing until they were like winding tunnels, twisting and spiraling into a maze of darkness. The shelves seemed to lean in, their towering heights casting long, oppressive shadows that reached out toward her. The air grew thick and suffocating, making it hard to breathe. It felt like she was being smothered, the weight of the darkness pressing down on her chest. Mia turned, but there was no longer a clear path. The store had transformed. The once familiar aisles had turned into an alien landscape, a twisted version of the place she had known. Every direction felt wrong, as though she were trapped in a nightmare with no way out. She ran. Her footsteps echoed in the silence, the sound of her own frantic movement almost deafening. She had no destination in mind. She just needed to keep moving, to escape the feeling of being hunted, of being watched. But no matter how fast she ran, the store seemed to stretch on forever. The aisles stretched endlessly in front of her, and behind her, she could hear it, the sound of something following, something moving just out of sight, always just a few steps behind. She dared not look over her shoulder. She knew it would be there, whatever it was, and it was closing in on her. Her pulse surged in her ears, and her breath came in ragged gasps. She pushed harder, faster, her legs aching, but the store seemed to mock her efforts. No matter how hard she ran, she couldn't escape. She was trapped. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something. A door. It was a door she didn't recognize, one that wasn't there before. It stood at the end of a narrow aisle, hidden behind a row of shelves. Her mind screamed at her to stop, to turn back, but she couldn't. She had to try. Mia sprinted toward the door, her body screaming with exhaustion, her mind a blur of panic. She reached it and grabbed the handle, wrenching it open. To her surprise, it didn't feel locked. She stepped into the room, her heart pounding, and slammed the door shut behind her. The room was dark, but there was something different about it. The air was thick, oppressive, like the darkness itself was waiting for her. She pressed her back against the door, her breath coming in short gasps. She dared not turn on the lights. She knew somehow that it would only make things worse. But there was something in the room with her. She could feel it. She could hear it breathing. And then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps coming closer. Mia's heart skipped a beat as she realized what was happening. She was not alone. The thing that had been following her was here. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and then the whispers began. Low at first, barely audible, but then they grew louder, clearer. "Leave now." Mia's blood ran cold. The voice wasn't human. It was something darker, something older. Something that had been waiting, patient, in the shadows of the store. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. She had to do something. She couldn't just hide forever. The door, she had to open it and find a way out. But as she moved toward the door, her hand trembling on the handle, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Stay." It was no longer a request. It was a command. Her breath caught in her throat as she slowly turned the handle. But when the door opened, she found herself back in the store. The aisles were just as twisted as before, but something had changed. The air felt different, thicker, and the darkness had taken on a weight of its own, pressing in from all sides. She was back where she had started, and this time she knew there was no escape. Mia's mind raced, panic clawing at her chest as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. The store was no longer just a place. It was a labyrinth, a maze of corridors that stretched on forever, bending and warping, like some horrific nightmare with no end. Each turn she took led to more shadows, more darkened aisles that seemed to close in around her, suffocating her. The whispers hadn't stopped. They swirled around her, surrounding her from every direction, growing louder and more insistent. "Stay!" they hissed, the voices warped and otherworldly. Mia's heart hammered in her chest, the rhythmic beat of it drowned out by the maddening cacophony. It was as though the store itself was alive, and it was drawing her into its dark heart. She ran again, her footsteps frantic against the cold, hard floors. She didn't know where she was going. There was no plan, no hope, just the need to escape the ever-tightening grip of the store's malevolent presence. She needed to find an exit, but the aisles twisted and shifted, as though the store itself were mocking her, offering glimpses of freedom only to snatch it away at the last moment. Then something changed. The air grew colder, colder than before, almost biting. Her breath misted in front of her, a stark contrast to the oppressive warmth that had filled the store earlier. The lights flickered once more, then went out completely. Darkness, absolute, suffocating darkness. Mia stopped, her hands shaking as she tried to adjust, to make out any shapes in the blackness. But there was nothing, no light, no sound, nothing, except for the footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Mia's stomach turned. She wasn't alone. She hadn't been alone for a long time, not since the moment the lights had first gone out. Whatever was in this store with her had been watching her, following her, its presence like a shadow that clung to her every move. The footsteps grew louder. She turned, her body trembling, but the darkness offered no refuge. There was no one there, only the echoes of those footsteps, echoing in her mind, growing louder, closer, until it felt as though the entire store was closing in on her. Then she saw it, a pale figure, barely visible in the dark, standing at the end of the aisle. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that stretched unnaturally long, twisted in ways that defied logic. The figure's face was obscured, its features hidden beneath the darkness that clung to it, but Mia could feel its gaze. It was watching her. The air shifted. Mia felt a chill not just from the cold, but from the sense that this thing, whatever it was, had been waiting for her, and now it was ready to claim her. Mia's heart pounded as she stumbled backward, her body filled with a sudden, overwhelming fear. She had to get out. She had to move. But as she turned, the walls shifted. The aisles moved, twisting like the writhing coils of some massive, hungry beast. She was trapped. The store had become a living thing, and there was no escape. The footsteps were closer now, almost deafening in the silence. They were so close she could feel them vibrating in the floor beneath her, the very air trembling with the presence of whatever was stalking her. And then the voice, a low, guttural whisper that made her skin crawl. "Don't run." Mia froze. The voice wasn't just in her ears. It was inside her head, crawling into her thoughts, twisting them, wrapping them around her mind like an iron fist. "Stay. It's too late for you. Too late for anyone." She couldn't breathe. The air was thick, heavy, pressing in on her chest like a weight she couldn't escape. The walls of the store seemed to close in tighter, the aisles narrowing, the shelves towering overhead like endless dark giants. And then, with a final deafening crack, the lights flickered back to life. Mia blinked, disoriented, but what she saw made her stomach drop. The store was different, changed. The shelves, once neatly arranged, were now disorganized, their contents scattered across the floors in violent disarray. The aisles were filled with shadows that seemed to twist and writhe, as if alive. And the figure, it was gone, vanished. But she could still feel its presence, lingering in the air like a cold, suffocating fog. The footsteps stopped. There was silence now, an oppressive, suffocating silence that filled the store, but it was a silence that made Mia feel like she was waiting for something, waiting for the next step, the next move. She wasn't alone, but nothing was there. Not yet. The sudden ringing of the store's emergency alarm shattered the stillness, the high-pitched sound cutting through the air like a knife. Mia's heart leaped in her chest as she spun toward the source, a strange sense of dread creeping through her veins. Was it a warning? She had no choice. She had to get out, ignoring the pounding in her head, the overwhelming sensation of being watched. She sprinted toward the emergency exit at the back of the store. The door, once solid, now looked warped, its metal frame twisted as though it had been bent by some unseen force. She pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. And then behind her she heard it. The footsteps. They were back. Closer. Faster. Mia's breath hitched as she slammed her shoulder against the door, her entire body trembling with the weight of her fear. She could feel the presence behind her now, could hear its breath, slow, steady, and heavy. Too late. It was too late. The darkness had already consumed her. Mia stood in the middle of the store, her chest rising and falling rapidly as the air seemed to press in on her. Her eyes darted around, but the aisles now felt like they were closing in, stretching into an inescapable labyrinth. She had thought, even for a moment, that she had found a way out, but now the truth was impossible to ignore. There was nowhere to run. The whispering had stopped. The footsteps too. But Mia felt the presence, lingering just beyond the edges of her sight, always there, waiting for her to make the next move. She swallowed hard, trying to quiet the rising panic in her chest, trying to ignore the knot of terror tightening in her gut. The store had become something else, something not of this world. Its walls no longer felt solid. The lights flickered once more, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. In their flicker, the aisles seemed to bend and warp, like reflections in a distorted mirror. The shelves were no longer filled with mundane products, but with strange, grotesque items. Things she had never seen before, twisted objects that looked like they had been plucked from some kind of nightmare. And then the air grew colder, a chill that seeped into her bones, as if the very temperature of the store had dropped into an abyss. Mia could feel the temperature change, the hairs on her arms rising as goosebumps spread across her skin. The oppressive darkness wrapped around her like a suffocating shroud, and she knew deep down that whatever was hunting her was drawing nearer. She could hear the scrape of something across the floor, a slow, deliberate dragging sound that sent her heart racing. Her mind screamed for her to move, to run, but her legs felt like they were made of lead, frozen in place by the terror gripping her. She tried to turn, to get her bearings, but the store seemed to have shifted again, the aisles twisting, the rows of shelves no longer aligned as they had been moments ago. Something in the shadows moved. It wasn't a person, she knew that, even before she caught a glimpse of the tall, hunched shape that emerged from the dark. Its skin was slick and pale, stretched over its bones like a corpse that had been twisted out of shape. Its eyes were dark pits, empty and hollow, and its mouth hung open, revealing rows of jagged teeth that seemed far too large for its face. Mia took a shaky step back, her heart pounding in her throat. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts, but the creature didn't move. It simply stood there, staring at her with those empty eyes, as if it was waiting for her to make the next move. A low growl rumbled in its throat, a sound that reverberated in the stillness of the store. The noise was low and guttural, like a warning, like a predator preparing to strike. And then, without any warning, the creature lunged forward. Mia's body reacted before her mind could catch up. She spun, bolting down one of the aisles as fast as her legs would carry her. The sound of the creature's footsteps followed, its eerie growl echoing through the aisles as it chased her. She didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. All she knew was that she had to get out of the store, had to find the exit before it was too late. But as she rounded a corner, she found herself facing another hallway, another aisle that seemed to stretch on endlessly. The store had turned into a maze, a never-ending labyrinth that twisted in on itself, trapping her within its walls. And then a flicker. It was brief, just a flash of light, but it was enough to stop her in her tracks. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as she realized what she had seen. A door. The same door she had tried to escape through earlier, the one that had led her back to the store. Mia hesitated, her mind racing. She couldn't go through it again. She couldn't face the same horrors over and over. But what choice did she have? With trembling hands, she ran toward the door, her heart hammering in her chest. She could hear the creature behind her, its footsteps closing in with each passing second. She reached the door, throwing it open with all her strength, and stepped through into the unknown. This time, the store was different. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, the floors sticky beneath her feet, as if something had been spilled long ago and left to rot. She could hear the sounds of distant whispers, a soft murmur that seemed to come from all around her. But there was something else, a new sound, one that filled the air with an oppressive weight. It was a laugh, low and mocking, like the sound of a predator toying with its prey. Mia's blood ran cold as the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She turned slowly, her body trembling with fear, but there was no one there. Just the endless dark. The laughter echoed again, this time closer, as if someone, or something, was standing just behind her. She whirled around, her eyes darting wildly in every direction, but there was nothing there. Only darkness. And then a voice. It wasn't the creature's. It was soft, familiar, and unmistakable. It was her own voice. "Why are you running, Mia?" the voice whispered, a breathy hiss that sent chills down her spine. "You've been here all along." Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't want to believe it, didn't want to face the reality of what was happening, but the truth was unavoidable. The store, the darkness, it wasn't just a place. It was her prison, a place that had drawn her in and trapped her within its walls. The store had claimed her, and there was no way out. Mia felt herself begin to tremble as she realized the full extent of the horror she was trapped in. She was not just being hunted. She was being consumed, piece by piece, her very essence absorbed by the malevolent force that had taken control of the store. The laughter continued, rising in pitch, echoing in her ears as the walls closed in around her. And Mia understood, finally, that there was no escape. Not anymore. The store had her now. Forever. The air seemed to grow heavier around Mia as the store's walls pulsated, as if alive, breathing with a rhythm that matched the growing panic in her chest. The voice, it was her voice, lingered in her ears, its mocking tone burrowing deep into her mind. Her fingers tightened into fists, nails digging into her palms as she fought to maintain some semblance of control. She wouldn't believe it. This couldn't be real. She had to fight back, to break free. But the store had shifted, and the rules had changed. No longer a place she knew. It was an entity now, a living, breathing nightmare of its own creation. Mia stumbled through the aisles, her movements erratic as she searched for an exit that no longer existed. Every turn she made led her deeper into the suffocating blackness. Her eyes were wide, scanning for something, anything, that could offer a hint of escape, but the shelves seemed to stretch on endlessly, mocking her attempts to find a way out. A strange, rattling sound filled the air, like the scraping of metal against metal. Mia froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She turned slowly, desperately trying to locate the source of the noise. It wasn't the creature, it was something different, something closer. There, in the corner of her vision, a flicker of movement. Her pulse raced as her head snapped in the direction of the sound. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, its form obscured by the darkness. It moved with unnatural precision, gliding silently across the floor, its footsteps silent, but somehow echoing in the stillness. This new figure was not human. Mia could feel it, deep within her bones. Its presence radiated a sense of emptiness, as if it existed in a space between worlds. It was there, but not really there, and it exuded a feeling of dread so powerful it sent a cold shiver crawling up her spine. The figure paused just beyond the reach of the dim light, and Mia's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't see its face, but she could feel its gaze, cold and empty, locked on her. It was as though it knew her every thought, every fear. "You're not supposed to be here," the voice came again, her voice, but distorted, twisted, like it had been dragged through 1,000 different nightmares. "You never were." Mia's stomach lurched. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't obey. It was as though the store itself had taken control of her, paralyzing her, making her its puppet. With trembling hands, she tried to move, but it was too late. The figure took a slow step forward, its movements almost graceful in the way it glided across the floor. Mia's feet remained glued to the ground, her body unable to respond as the figure drew nearer. It stopped inches from her. The air grew colder, the temperature plummeting so sharply that Mia could see her breath form in a thin mist before her. And then it spoke, the voice coming from everywhere at once, surrounding her, enveloping her in a suffocating embrace. "You never left, Mia. You were always here. We've always been here." Her pulse thundered in her ears as the words sunk into her mind like a poison. The figure lifted its arm, and Mia instinctively stepped back, though her legs still refused to obey. The arm stretched out impossibly long, its fingers curling toward her. It was close, too close. Mia could feel the cold, dark energy radiating from it, and in that moment she understood. This wasn't just a creature hunting her. This was the store. This was the building itself. The malevolent force that had fed on the souls of those trapped inside, consumed them, and twisted them into something unrecognizable. The figure's fingers brushed against Mia's cheek, and the coldness sank into her skin, a chilling burn that left her numb. Her heart stopped for a second, the world spinning as her vision blurred. She felt her mind begin to slip, to unravel, as the store's grip tightened. A sharp, searing pain pierced her skull, and Mia gasped, stumbling back. Her body screamed for release, but she couldn't break free. She was trapped, just as every soul before her had been. The figure drew closer, its form beginning to distort, its body writhing and twisting, stretching in ways that defied logic. Mia's breath quickened, panic overtaking her as the thing leaned in, its face still hidden in the shadows. It was only then that Mia realized the truth. The store wasn't just trying to kill her. It was trying to claim her, to take her soul, to feed on her essence and make her a part of the endless void within the walls. Mia tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The air around her thickened, and her thoughts began to blur, mixing with the whispers of the store. She could feel her reality slipping away, her body becoming lighter, more insubstantial, until she was no more than a wisp of smoke in the darkness. But even as she felt herself fading, one thought remained clear in her mind. She was never meant to leave. Mia's sense of self began to dissolve, her consciousness drifting like sand slipping through an hourglass. Every heartbeat felt like an eternity as the store's grip tightened, suffocating the life from her. She was no longer Mia. She was becoming part of the dark, the endless void, and the twisted pulse of the building itself. The figure before her, now more monstrous than human, continued to shift and writhe in the shadows. It was changing, morphing into something far more sinister. Its limbs elongated, cracking and bending, and the air around it grew thick with a sense of malicious hunger. The face remained hidden, but Mia could feel its presence, an all-consuming darkness that wanted nothing more than to erase her. For a moment, everything stopped. The world around her became still, and Mia could hear the faint sound of her own breath, shallow and labored. She was aware of the cold that enveloped her, the deep chill seeping into her bones, but it felt distant now, like an echo of something she once understood. Then the silence shattered. A loud, grinding noise ripped through the air, as though something ancient and broken was being torn apart. The floor beneath Mia's feet trembled, and she felt the store's walls close in, their very structure shifting as if the building itself was coming alive, reacting to her presence. The figure, no longer merely a creature, but a grotesque amalgamation of the store's twisted power, began to speak again. Its voice was distorted, layered with countless others, each one more desperate than the last. "We are Legion," it said, its words crawling into her ears, each syllable echoing through her skull. "And you belong to us now." The words reverberated, mingling with the oppressive hum of the store, as if the building was speaking through the figure itself. The walls creaked, the lights flickering as they struggled to stay alive, but the shadows only grew darker, thicker. Mia could feel the store's pulse beneath her skin, the cold seeping deeper into her body. The hunger was growing. She fought to keep her thoughts intact, to resist the pull of the darkness. Her eyes flickered toward the security desk, the last place that might offer a shred of safety. If she could make it there, maybe, just maybe, she could escape. But the path was obscured by the figure that loomed before her, blocking every possible route. The store's power was overwhelming, its will unyielding. Mia knew the only way out was to fight, to break free from the nightmare that had become her reality. She took a deep breath, feeling the chill run through her lungs, and braced herself. Without thinking, she lunged forward, desperate to break free, to escape the suffocating grasp of the figure. Her hands reached for the desk, her fingers grazing its edge as she scrambled forward, the world spinning around her. She could feel the pull of the darkness, the figure's presence pressing in on her from all sides, but she refused to let it consume her. She had to survive. The desk was within her reach, but just as her fingers brushed the surface, the figure's cold hand gripped her shoulder, and everything stopped. Mia gasped, her body freezing in place. Her mind screamed for release, but her body refused to move. The store had her. She felt herself being dragged back, her feet lifting off the ground as the figure pulled her away. The walls closed in tighter, the shadows pressing in, and Mia was aware of nothing but the overwhelming darkness. And then, just as it seemed like all hope was lost, a sudden, deafening noise rang out. The lights flickered violently, and a surge of power coursed through the building. Mia felt the shift, the walls trembled, and the floor beneath her feet began to shake. She could hear a sound rising above the cacophony of terror, a heavy, grinding noise, like metal scraping against metal. It was then that she realized the truth. The store was fighting back. The figure recoiled, its form twisting in agony as the power surged through the building. It howled, a sound that reverberated through Mia's bones, but it was weakening. The very foundation of the store was beginning to crack under the pressure, its hold on her loosening. With a final, desperate push, Mia broke free. She fell to the ground, gasping for air, her body trembling as she scrambled toward the door. The store screamed in fury, its walls shifting and groaning as though it was alive, but Mia didn't look back. She ran. Every step was a battle as the store fought to drag her back, but Mia refused to let it take her. She reached the door, her hand trembling as she grabbed the handle. It was locked, but not for long. With a swift movement, she slammed her shoulder into it, forcing it open. The world outside greeted her like a forgotten dream. The streetlights flickered in the distance, casting long shadows across the empty streets. The night air was cold, but it felt like freedom. Mia didn't stop to look back. She ran, the sounds of the store's fury growing faint as she put distance between herself and the nightmare she had escaped. But even as she ran, the words of the figure echoed in her mind, a warning that would haunt her forever. "You can't escape us." And deep down, Mia knew the truth. The store would always be with her, its darkness, its hunger, its insatiable desire to consume. It was never really over. Mia's breath came in sharp, desperate gasps as she ran through the empty streets. The chill of the night air didn't register against her skin. Her entire body felt numb, overwhelmed by the terror she had just experienced. But something lingered in her mind, a nagging sensation at the back of her thoughts. She couldn't shake it. The store, the creature that had tormented her, that had almost consumed her, was still there, lurking, waiting. Her feet pounded against the pavement, and with each step, the further she pushed from the horror that had unfolded in that forsaken store. Yet, the creeping dread that clung to her like a shadow refused to loosen its grip. She found herself glancing over her shoulder every few seconds, half expecting the figure to appear behind her, a specter stalking her through the streets. But there was nothing, only the quiet of the night. No sounds, no movement. Despite the stillness, Mia felt a constant unease, as if the world around her was holding its breath, watching. The air seemed thicker, more suffocating, like the very atmosphere itself had been altered by her encounter. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of running, she came to a stop. Her legs were heavy, her energy depleted, but she couldn't afford to rest. She was still too close to the nightmare. But where could she go? Where was safe? She took a moment to catch her breath and glanced around, trying to get her bearings. The buildings on the street were dark, their windows black voids. She was near her apartment now, a couple of blocks away, but the thought of returning to that place terrified her. The walls, the windows, even the air inside her apartment felt suffocating and strange. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and Mia startled. She hadn't even realized she'd been holding it. It was a message from her friend, Sarah. "Hey, are you okay? You left your stuff at the store. I'm really worried about you. You didn't seem yourself tonight. Call me when you get this." Mia stared at the message, her hand trembling as she held the phone. She didn't know what to say, what to do. How could she explain what had happened? How could anyone understand the horror she had just lived through? Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a loud, echoing crash. Mia's heart skipped a beat, her body tensing as the noise reverberated down the street. She spun around, her pulse racing, but saw nothing. The street remained quiet, still, as if nothing had happened. But something inside her snapped. She wasn't alone. She started walking, slowly at first, as though trying to make sense of what was happening. But then, the familiar weight of the darkness pressed in on her once more. Her breath hitched as she reached the corner of her building and glanced back toward the store. The lights were out, the windows dark, but she could swear she saw movement inside. It was too much. The suffocating feeling from the store was following her, invading her every thought, every breath. She had escaped it. She had escaped, but the terror still gnawed at her, refusing to release its grip. She couldn't run forever. With shaky hands, Mia fumbled for the apartment keys. Her vision blurred, but she forced herself to steady her breath. She had to get inside. She had to hide. Her heart raced in her chest, the urgency overwhelming her senses as she quickly unlocked the door and stumbled inside. The apartment felt different, colder somehow, as though it, too, had been touched by the horror. The very walls seemed to close in on her, the air growing dense. Mia froze, her eyes scanning every corner of the room, every shadow. Was it still following her? She didn't know. She didn't care. She was too exhausted, too shaken to think clearly. But as she stepped into the apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was not alone. A soft creak sounded from behind her, followed by another. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Slowly she turned. The shadows in her apartment shifted. The lights flickered, their dim glow barely illuminating the room. And then, in the corner of her eye, she saw it. The figure. Not entirely solid, not entirely real, but there. Watching. Waiting. A breath caught in her throat as she realized the truth. The store hadn't just been an entity, it was a doorway. A link between the worlds, between the living and something darker, something older. And now it had followed her here. She staggered backward, the reality crashing down on her. She had thought she had escaped it, but the darkness, the hunger, was always just a step behind. Mia's body trembled as she backed toward the door, her mind racing. She had to get out. She had to leave, or else. The figure inched closer, its form becoming more defined. It was an amalgamation of everything that had been left behind, a twisted version of the store's malevolent force. Its features were obscured, a shadow without a face, but the hunger in its presence was unmistakable. "No," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. I can't let it take me." The door. Her mind locked onto the door, her only chance of escape. She rushed toward it, her hand gripping the handle, but as she pulled it resisted. Heavier than ever, as if the building itself had turned against her. The figure's breath was hot against her skin, its presence pressing in from all sides. It spoke in the same voice, the same many-layered tone. "We are Legion. You are ours." Mia screamed, wrenching at the door, pulling with all her strength. And then, with a final, desperate shove, the door gave way. The outside world greeted her like a distant memory. Mia stumbled into the hallway, her legs giving way beneath her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. She wouldn't. She didn't know how much time passed. Whether it was minutes or hours, all she could hear was her heartbeat pounding in her ears. But she kept running. Mia's feet slapped against the cold, sterile tiles of the apartment building hallway as she ran, each step reverberating with the sound of her heartbeat thundering in her chest. Her breath was shallow, quick, like a drowning woman gasping for air. Her vision swam, her head spinning as adrenaline surged through her veins. She couldn't hear anything anymore, nothing but the deafening roar of panic ringing in her ears. She stumbled around the corner and crashed into a wall, the impact rattling her bones. She pushed herself away, her hand trembling as she reached for the stairwell door, praying it wasn't locked. With a soft click, it opened. Mia didn't hesitate. She surged forward, her legs barely carrying her as she clambered up the stairs. Each step felt like a mile, each breath harder than the last. Her mind screamed at her to keep going, but her body was fighting against her, demanding rest, demanding release from the fear that gripped her. But there was no stopping. Not now. The thing, the creature, the thing from the store, it was close, too close. She could feel its presence behind her, lurking, waiting, like it had never left. It was following her, trailing her through the building, through the very air she breathed. Mia reached the fourth floor and shoved open the door. She didn't even know where she was going, but she couldn't stand still anymore. She had to move, had to escape, had to get as far away as possible. She ran past apartments, the doorways dark and foreboding. The hallway seemed endless, stretching before her like a maze that had no exit. She glanced over her shoulder. Nothing. Her chest tightened with the sudden feeling of being watched, and she whipped around. Nothing but shadows, but she felt it, the coldness creeping in. A door opened nearby, and Mia froze. Her eyes locked onto the figure standing in the doorway, its silhouette indistinct but undeniably human. It was a neighbor, she realized. A man from 2 doors down, someone she'd seen around the building a few times. He looked disoriented, as if he had been woken suddenly from a deep sleep. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low, filled with concern. Mia shook her head, her eyes wide with panic. She didn't know if she could trust him. She didn't know if anyone in this building was safe anymore. I can't," Mia gasped, stumbling backward. It's following me. It's here in the building. You have to leave. You have to get out." The man's face faltered for a moment, his expression turning unreadable. "What do you mean? What's following you?" Mia didn't have the energy to explain. She barely understood herself. All she knew was that whatever had been lurking in the dark, whatever had haunted her in the store, had followed her here, to this place, to this moment. The man took a step forward, his brow furrowing in confusion. "You need to calm down. There's nothing." His words were cut short. A loud bang, like something heavy being thrown against a wall, rattled the building. The air seemed to shift around them, thick with an oppressive weight. The man's eyes widened in disbelief. What the hell was that? Mia didn't wait for him to react. She bolted. She couldn't let him get caught in whatever this thing was. She didn't want anyone else to experience what she had. She turned a corner, her legs burning as she ran down the hallway, barely able to see through the darkness. Her pulse was racing. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and her mind raced with fear. She passed an open door, one she didn't recognize. Inside, she saw something that made her heart freeze in her chest. A figure, standing in the shadows of the room. Its back was to her, but it was unmistakable. It was the thing from the store. The creature, its form flickering in and out of focus, like an illusion. Mia's blood ran cold. It had followed her here. She could see its long, twisted limbs, the unnatural way its body shifted as if it didn't belong to the world at all. Her mouth went dry, her heart pounding in her ears as she turned on her heel, running harder now, not looking back. Not daring to. She could hear it behind her now. The sounds of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing in the hallway. The thing was gaining on her. Her apartment was at the far end of the hallway, and the thought of running back there, of returning to the place that had now become a tomb, made her stomach churn. But there was no other option. She had to reach her apartment, had to lock herself inside, and pray for morning. She could feel it, its presence like a weight on her chest. She didn't look back, but she could sense it coming closer. Her mind screamed at her to keep going, to not stop. The door to her apartment was just ahead, but before she could reach it, a sudden scream echoed through the hallway. It was the man from 2 doors down. The sound was high-pitched, full of terror, and then abruptly stopped. Mia's heart raced. She couldn't stop. She couldn't afford to stop. Not for anyone. But she couldn't leave him either. Torn, she hesitated just for a moment, just enough to hear the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, scraping against the floor. It was too late. Whatever had taken the man was already in motion, and she had no time to help him. With a scream of her own, Mia shoved her hand into the door handle of her apartment and twisted. The door wouldn't open. The door wouldn't open. "Please, please," she whispered to herself, panicking, yanking on the handle. Her heart thudded in her chest. The sound of the thing drawing closer was now unmistakable, like claws dragging against the floor. Finally, the door opened. Mia stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind her. She leaned against the door, her breathing coming in jagged bursts. She was safe. For now. But that feeling, the feeling of being watched, never left. It lingered. The thing was still out there, still hunting, and as the shadows in her apartment deepened, she knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Mia slid down to the floor, trembling, her eyes darting around the room, waiting for the next sound, the next breath, the next scream. And when the door suddenly creaked, she knew it wasn't over yet. Mia's eyes shot to the door. Her pulse skipped a beat as she held her breath. The creaking sound was soft, but it was unmistakable. Slowly, the door inched open, as if something on the other side were testing its weight. She hadn't heard anyone approach, no footsteps, no sounds of breathing, just that eerie, unnatural movement. She crawled backwards, her back hitting the far wall of the apartment as she watched the door, her body rigid with fear. The room, once her sanctuary, now felt like a trap. The space felt smaller with each passing second, the air thicker, heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. The door creaked again, this time louder, like something was trying to force its way inside. Mia's heartbeat surged again, erratic and frantic. She could hear nothing but the pounding of her own blood rushing in her ears. She couldn't move. Her limbs were frozen in place, her body paralyzed by terror. The door moved another inch. The room seemed to hold its breath. Mia forced herself to shift, her eyes darting around for any escape, any weapon. But the only thing nearby was the old chair she'd been sitting in earlier. She grabbed it, clutching it in her trembling hands. If the thing came through that door, she would fight. She had to. Suddenly, a shadow crossed the gap in the door, blocking the dim light from the hallway. Mia froze, watching it closely, her breath catching in her throat. Something was there. Something was outside. She could feel its presence, the air around her now heavy with an unspoken, chilling threat. It wasn't human. It wasn't even close. The door stopped moving, and the silence stretched long, almost unbearable. She waited, her body tense, every muscle wound as tight as a coiled spring. And then, a low, guttural growl. It was soft at first, like a whisper, but it was unmistakable. A sound that seemed to vibrate through the very walls, deep and unnatural. Her heart skipped again, the terror bubbling up in her throat. She could hear it now. It was breathing, a cold, labored breath, shallow but growing heavier with each passing moment. Mia pressed her back harder against the wall, trying to make herself as small as possible. But the fear that coursed through her veins was almost too much to handle. The growl had stopped, replaced by that low, rhythmic breathing. It was close now, closer than ever before. Mia's mind raced. What could she do? What could she possibly do against something like this? She needed to think. She needed a plan. The creature was close. She knew it was, and every instinct screamed at her to flee. But there was nowhere to go. The windows were locked, the hallway outside dark and endless. She couldn't outrun it. The only place to go was back into the darkness of the apartment, into the very room it was already in. Another breath. Closer. She needed to distract it. Something. Anything. Anything to give her a moment's head start. Slowly, she took a deep breath. Her hand tightened around the chair leg. Then, without a second thought, she swung it toward the door. The loud crash reverberated through the room, but it didn't stop the creature from breathing. It didn't even flinch. She screamed, hurling the chair at the door with all the strength she could muster. The impact knocked the door back a bit more, but it didn't swing open. There was a silence that followed, a heavy, almost suffocating silence. And then the growl returned, louder, more intense. It was right outside the door now. Mia's breath hitched. She could almost feel the creature's eyes on her, piercing her very soul. She turned, her eyes darting desperately for anything she could use. The apartment was dark, the faint glow from the hallway providing little comfort. She could make out the shapes of her furniture, the shadows cast by the looming shapes of the walls, but nothing that could help her, nothing that could save her. But then a small glimmer of light, the lamp on the side table. She had left it on earlier. She didn't know why, but now it could be her salvation. If she could reach it, if she could turn it on full, maybe the creature would back away, afraid of the light. Mia dove for the lamp, her heart pounding in her chest. She fumbled with the switch, but it wouldn't turn on. Her hands were shaking too much, her fingers slipping on the cold metal. She glanced over her shoulder. The door. It was open. The creature had entered. Mia's stomach turned. The room was darker now, but she could make out the figure standing in the doorway. A shape, a massive, hulking mass of shadows. Its eyes glowed faintly, not with light, but with something deeper. Something wrong. And as she looked into them, she felt as though it was looking straight through her, seeing everything she was and wasn't. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. It stepped forward, slowly, methodically, and then the light flickered. It wasn't the lamp, but the overhead bulb. It buzzed, its glow faltering, struggling to stay on. The creature stopped. It tilted its head. Mia didn't wait. She grabbed the lamp and smashed it against the floor. The glass shattered, sending a cascade of sparks into the air. The room lit up in sudden brightness, the intense light filling every corner. The creature recoiled, its form distorting in the blinding light. Mia scrambled to her feet. Her mind was racing, no plan, no idea what to do, but she couldn't wait anymore. She ran for the door. She couldn't stay here. She had to get out. With one final glance at the creature, now retreating into the shadows, she bolted into the hallway. The light flickered again, and as the door slammed behind her, locking the creature inside, she heard it, its growl rising again, louder than before. It wasn't over, but Mia had escaped for now. She didn't know what would happen next, or if she'd survive another night. But as she stepped into the hallway, blood pounding in her ears, one thing was clear. The nightmare was just beginning. Mia ran down the hallway, her steps loud in the stillness of the apartment building. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to stop, to take a breath, but she couldn't. She wouldn't. The creature was behind her, its growls still echoing in her mind. She could almost feel its hot breath on her neck, could almost hear its footsteps creeping closer, stalking her. Her eyes darted from door to door, but she didn't stop to check if anyone else was awake. It didn't matter. No one could help her now. Not with what she'd seen. No one would believe her. Mia reached the stairs and took them two at a time. She could feel the pulse in her temples, the adrenaline coursing through her veins as she moved faster, as if the building itself was conspiring to keep her trapped inside. She reached the landing of the next floor, panting, but forced herself to keep moving. Her footsteps echoed in the narrow stairwell. At the end of the hall, she spotted an emergency exit sign glowing dimly in the distance. It was her only chance. If she could get out of the building, maybe she could escape whatever was hunting her. She could barely focus on the distance between her and the door. Another growl echoed through the stairwell, much closer this time. Mia's heart skipped a beat. Her head whipped around, scanning the shadows. The growl was followed by a scraping sound, like claws dragging against metal, scratching, clawing, getting closer. Her mind screamed at her to run faster, but her legs felt as if they were made of lead. She reached the exit door and slammed her shoulder into it, her fingers pulling frantically at the handle. The door refused to budge. Her breath caught in her throat, her desperation mounting as she realized the door was locked. She didn't have time for this. Come on," she whispered urgently to herself, her fingers fumbling with the handle. The scrape of claws against metal grew louder. Her pulse spiked, her hands trembling. Then, as if in response to her terror, the door clicked open. Mia stumbled forward into the alley behind the building, gasping for air, her legs shaking with the effort. She turned, glancing over her shoulder. The creature hadn't followed her. Not yet. She didn't dare stop to catch her breath. She kept running, down the alley, away from the building. She could hear the faint sounds of the creature's growls, but they were distant now. She didn't know if it was still after her, or if it was simply waiting, lurking in the shadows. As she reached the street, she looked around for anything that could help her, anyone who could help. But the street was eerily quiet. The city, once bustling and full of life, now felt deserted. The streetlights cast long, lonely shadows, and Mia felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. She couldn't keep running forever. She needed to make sure she was safe, that she was far enough away from the thing that had been hunting her. She couldn't go back to her apartment. Not now. Not after what she'd seen. She stumbled into a nearby cafe, hoping to find some refuge, but when she entered, the lights flickered and then went out completely. Mia froze. The silence that followed was suffocating. She couldn't see anything in the pitch-black room. Her eyes strained, but nothing. The cafe was cold, the air thick with the same sense of unease she had felt in the apartment building. Then she heard it, the soft scrape of claws against the floor. Her heart skipped a beat. It was back. Mia turned to run, but something caught her ankle. She was pulled to the ground with a violent force, her body crashing against the cold floor. She screamed, kicking and thrashing, but something powerful gripped her, holding her still. In the dark, she could barely make out a shape moving closer to her. The air grew heavier, thick with the same suffocating presence. The growl, low and menacing, filled her ears. Something sharp pressed against her skin, cold and wet. Mia twisted and gasped for air, but the thing wouldn't let go. It was there, hovering over her, its presence all-consuming. Her mind raced, and in the pitch black, Mia thought of the only weapon she had. Desperately, she reached for her phone, fumbling for it in her pocket. She finally got her hand on it, her fingers trembling as she swiped the screen. The light of her phone illuminated the creature's face. Mia gasped. It wasn't human. Its skin was a sickly shade of gray, its features contorted in unnatural ways. Its mouth stretched too wide, filled with rows of jagged, needle-sharp teeth. Its eyes, empty, hollow sockets, glowed faintly in the dark. And in that moment, Mia realized the truth. This thing wasn't just hunting her. It had been waiting for her. Before she could react, the creature hissed, a sound like nails scraping against a chalkboard. And with a terrifying force, it lunged forward, its sharp claws slashing toward her. The last thing Mia saw before the world went dark was its open mouth, ready to devour her whole. And then nothing. The city outside remained still, silent, waiting.